Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to the We Can Do Better keynote address. I'm so excited to welcome you into this space. My name is Brittany DaCosta, and I'm here today with my reporting, investigations, and adjudications co-lead, Deb Erks. Today's keynote is part of our National Skillshare series, where we feature subject matter experts in conversation about urgent issues, emerging trends, and promising practices and strategies to address gender-based violence on campus. Before we begin, a quick note on language and accessibility. Attendees can view live captions for this session by clicking on the link in the chat box. You can also listen to this session in French by selecting the French language channel using the interpretation menu. Today's session is also being recorded and will be available on our website along with a transcript. Possibility Seeds leads the Courage to Act project. We are a leading social change consultancy dedicated to gender justice, equity, and inclusion. With over 20 years experience working with community organizations, governments, private and public institutions, we care deeply about the impact of our work. Courage to Act is a multi-year national initiative to address and prevent gender-based violence on post-secondary campuses in Canada. It builds on the key recommendations within Possibility Seed's vital report, Courage to Act, developing a national framework to address and prevent gender-based violence at post-secondary institutions. Our project is the first national collaborative of its kind to bring together over 170 experts, advocates, and thought leaders from across Canada to address gender-based violence on campus. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our funders. Our project is made possible through generous support and funding from the Department for Women and Gender Equality, or WAGE, Federal Government of Canada. This work is taking place on and across the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. The land I'm currently on and where I live is Tadinaduni, or the place where they built, traditional lands of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee people, and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, subject to Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3. I want to acknowledge the Six Nations land defenders at 1492 Landback Lane, who have been protecting the unceded land granted to the Six Nations under the Between the Lakes Treaty from development for over 1,000 days now, and have been continuously facing legal, police, and state violence. You can support their efforts by donating to the camp and the legal fund. The link is in the chat. This criminalization of land defenders is just one example we continue to see of the process of colonization in Canada over the past 2 centuries that has enacted systematic genocide against the Indigenous peoples of this land. We see these acts of colonization and genocide continuing today in the forced sterilization of Indigenous women, the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care, the criminalization of Indigenous people resulting in overrepresentation in prisons, and environmental racism and land theft of Indigenous territories. As we come together to respond to experiences of gender-based violence, we must acknowledge that this is a decolonial struggle. They cannot be separated. Supporting decolonization and Indigenous sovereignty is critical to working towards a culture of consent and accountability. We honor and take direction from the experience and wisdom of Indigenous survivors, activists, frontline workers, writers, educators, healers, and artists. Today, we will take action by inviting everyone here to read the calls for justice within Reclaiming Power in Place, the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. You can download the worksheet on how your institution can answer these calls to action through the link in the chat. This work can be challenging. Many of us have our own experience of survivorship and of supporting those we love and care about who have experienced gender-based violence. A gentle reminder here to be attentive to our well-being as we engage in these difficult conversations. You can visit the self-care section of our Skillshare webpage or visit our self-care room by visiting the link in the chat. Throughout today's session, you'll be invited to participate using Mentimeter. To access the platform, go to menti.com on your computer or phone and enter the code that will be on the top of the slides. It will also be provided in the chat for you. You are also invited to enter questions into the Q&A box throughout the session, and we will pose these to our speaker at the end. We will try to engage with as many questions as we can in the time that we have together. At the end of the session, you will find a link to an evaluation form. We'd be grateful if you take a few minutes to share your feedback, as it helps us improve. This is anonymous. Following the session, we will also email you with a copy of the evaluation form and a link to the recording so you can view it again and share with your network. So to put today's session into context, I'll share a little bit about the work we've done and our approach to it. Our work really began with a comprehensive guide to campus GBV complaints, where we introduced the foundational standards of procedural fairness, trauma-informed practice, and harm reduction, and offered strategies for complaints process policy and practice. We offered training on the foundational standards and deep dives into each step of the complaints process. We also explored unsettled questions with expert panels to provide some guidance in areas where we don't have all the answers yet. And Deb created a simple questions with complicated answers blog series to give us foundational understanding of some seemingly straightforward but very nuanced concepts and questions. In doing this work, one thing that became very clear for us early on was the fact that complaints processes are inherently harmful for everyone involved. They're colonial processes that, no matter how good our policies and practices are, will never be supportive to participants. It was also very apparent that there was resistance to incorporating what we have named as foundational standards, trauma-informed practice and harm reduction, into complaints processes out of fear that doing so would infringe on the ability to be procedurally fair. A big focus of our work has been dispelling this idea, showing how being trauma-informed and taking steps to mitigate the inherent harm actually supports procedural fairness and makes complaint processes safer for complainants, respondents, investigators, and adjudicators. So while we spent the last 5 years deep into the weeds of complaints processes, we've done so with the recognition that we are not going to make complaint processes perfectly safe, and that we can do what we can to make them as good as they can be, while also advocating for them not to be the first or only option in response to gender-based violence. So today's keynote takes our work a step forward by moving beyond complaints processes for meaningful accountability. And this is why I am so thrilled to introduce Sarah Wolgemuth as our keynote speaker today. Sarah has worked in student services for the past 2 decades at the University of Alberta and is currently serving as a secondment to lead a new student experience strategic plan. Her day job is within the office of the Dean of Students as Assistant Dean Student Life. In this role, Sarah is responsible for a number of areas, including the implementation of the university's sexual violence policy for students. She led the development of a new student care coordination team to ensure that students who experience sexual and gender-based violence have the necessary information and support, and that accountabilities and options are in place for those responsible for causing harm. Her past roles have included overseeing the university's Residence Life program and Director of Student Services in the Faculty of Law. I'm going to hand things over to Deb now to share a bit about the origins of the We Can Do Better mantra.
Thank you, Brittany. So Sarah and I have been colleagues off and on for about 20 years, and our roles have drifted together and apart over that time. But in the last 12 years, we've worked together on some very thorny issues. And these were situations where there was no easy answer, and often we were choosing the least worst options, knowing that significant damage had already been done and that more harm to some was likely to follow. So invariably, we would return to this mantra. and it's the theme for the keynote address. It is a resounding, we can do better. The mantra came from feelings of distress about institutional responses or lack thereof, and frustration about the inadequacy of the institutional response to significant issues, but also a recognition of harm caused to both individuals and the community, and a bit of guilt, accountability for our own roles in the institutional response, sort of coupled with a helplessness to improve matters. Nevertheless, we persisted over the years, and with solid support and excellent teams, we've been able to make some what I think are pretty momentous changes in the way we approach and respond to sexual and gender-based violence. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sarah, who has listened thoughtfully to my off-the-charts ideas and said, I think we can make that work. She is unflappable and has been at the forefront of putting the concepts and principles of supportive accountability into practice. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Deb, and thanks, Brittany. As I said, my name is Sarah, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really grateful to be here today. As Brittany already said, this is a pretty big, complicated topic, but I do want to start by acknowledging that there's a lot of really good work happening. And I want to extend my gratitude to all of you and others out there who are working to support survivors, support our communities, and also working with people who have caused harm to try and prevent future violence from occurring. So today, I'll start off with some what I'm calling introductions and introductory thoughts. I'll share why I think this work is really critical, especially on post-secondary campuses. We'll explore needs versus desired outcomes in terms of an approach with this work. We'll look at possible accountability options when working with survivors. And then we'll go into a little bit about different approaches of working with people who have caused harm. And then as always, we'll do a wrap up and have some time for questions. My goal today is really just to give you some things to consider, some things to reflect on. I don't have all the answers, but I really do believe that we're going in the right direction. And so as Brittany said, we're going to be using Mentimeter today. And so you should see a code on the top of the screen. And this is just to make sure that everyone is familiar with using Menti. So just a really basic warm-up question. What's inspiring you lately? And this can be personal, professional. I'm here in Alberta, and while it's been very smoky, we had some rain the other day, and watching my flowers bloom is very inspiring. So we'll know this is working when we start to see things pop up on the screen. Oh, great, it's working. There's nothing more satisfying than seeing a Menti start to work. Oh, my children, that's beautiful. Longer days, absolutely, yes. We're pretty north here in Edmonton, and we get lots of sun. My colleagues, oh, a new job. Congratulations to that person. Oh, a puppy's joy all the time. I recently adopted 2 kittens, and they are all kinds of fun. Reading, summer weather, definitely looks like the seasonal change is inspiring to folks. And just to note that your entries into Menti they're anonymous, and I have all of the Mentis today set that you can do multiple responses, so you can contribute as you're comfortable. Amazing. Okay, it looks like Menti is working. That is great. Okay, so some introductions. I do want to start off by saying that while I'm deeply interested in this topic, I am not an expert, despite what Brittany and Deb said about me. I can really only speak from my experience and perspective, and I really do appreciate and welcome when my perspective is challenged and expanded with new information. And again, I just want to make sure we're always, going in that right direction. I consider myself a practitioner, administrator, and an advocate. Again, I've worked in student services for the last 20 years in residence, in student services and a faculty, and now centrally in our Office of the Dean of Students. And throughout my whole career, I've been in positions where I've heard disclosures from survivors and tried to work to address and support their needs. I also want to throw in my perspectives as a parent in doing this work. I have 3 younger children, and it's really fascinating doing this work and then also watching my kids' social development as they navigate different social situations. Just gives me a lot to reflect on, how they learn concepts like consent, healthy relationships, even at a really, really young age. And just last week, we were having dinner, and my daughter, who's in grade 3, asking her how her day was. And she said, Mom, I'm having a tough time. There's a boy at school, and at recess, he keeps throwing sand at me, and it's really getting to me. And I stopped and reflected and thought, what would my parents have told me, over 30 years ago, if a boy was throwing sand at me in a sandbox? And I probably would have been told that boy had a crush on me, and that probably would have been it. And I probably would have even been teased for it. And so I want to assure you that's not the response I gave my daughter. But just again, I think we're going in the right direction. And I know some kids might still hear that response, but yeah, if you have folks that you are responsible for, small children, they definitely give you a lot to reflect on. I was also a member of the Courage Check community of practice called Working with People Who Have Caused Harm. It's a mouthful, where we dug into this topic and we developed a roadmap and a guide for people engaging in this work. We called our work Supporting the Whole Campus Community, as an acknowledgement that gender-based violence doesn't just impact survivors and complainants, but that it is a larger social and community problem. I also want to mention my experience in training using restorative practices or restorative justice. Years ago, when I worked in residence, actually, Deb Eriks was responsible for rewriting our residence conduct policy and introducing a preferred route of having a restorative approach. And I think back to some of that training, and in particular, the focus on rebuilding trust and repairing the community and identifying and repairing the harms done is still training that's been beneficial to me in doing this type of work. And in particular, the emphasis on multi-partiality, which had been a concept that was new to me at the time. But I think, working with survivors and working with people who've caused harm, I'm not impartial. This work is values-based, and I do have a vested interest in, again, repairing harm and for individuals and within the community. And so, if that concept is new to you, it's something good to reflect on, to think how being multi-partial, working with different parties, can be really beneficial. And then Deb gave a bit of a spoiler about where this title came from, but I can't not mention it. And the title is great because depending on where you put the emphasis, it means an entirely different thing. And I do hope that you read and agree that we really can do better with how we support survivors in seeking meaningful accountability. But I will admit, this was something that I started saying years ago out of frustration. And it was usually when I felt that the actions that my university could or would take to support survivors and hold people accountable fell short of addressing the real needs of the situation. And I was usually the one on the front lines having to explain the details to the survivor. And so often I would call Deb to debrief after, and in a very frustrating way would just be like, we can do better, because I could see a different path forward. So that is a little bit about me. And so I'm going to throw another Menti at you today, just to get a sense of who's in the room. And so I would invite you to introduce yourself in whatever way feels comfortable. If you're someone who works frontline with students, if you're a policymaker, if you're just really curious about the topic. We'll see who we're sharing this space with today. Educator, beautiful. Ooh, policy and researcher, amazing. Frontline staff. Oh, a team lead for frontline, that's great. Oh, a parent, yes. Curious about the topic, administrator. Looks like we have a really good mix. And doing this type of work, I think the more perspectives, the better. So welcome to this space. Educator is getting bigger, so it looks like we have quite a few educators in this space. I would argue that you are probably all educators. Thank you, Deb. If that is you, Deb, for putting your name. Social worker, amazing. Okay, thank you, everybody. So I thought I'd give a little bit of context and clarity. I know that terms and language can vary a bit between settings, so I thought I would offer a few that I'll likely use a fair bit. The first is person who caused harm. So I'm going to use this today to refer to people that have either been alleged to have caused harm, so we've received a disclosure. Again, we're not talking about complaints processes today. So just to keep things simple, I'll use as an overarching term. This could refer to someone who is part of a complaints process, or we've just had a disclosure about. Interim measures, also being called immediate measures in some contexts. These are those non-disciplinary, non-punitive conditions that we may impose on persons alleged to have caused harm that would limit their privileges, but not their rights, in order to provide a safe environment for a survivor. And modifications, these are things that we can adjust or put into place to address a survivor's needs and help them feel safer on campus. And just a little bit about the University of Alberta context. So again, I'm in our Office of the Dean of Students, which is one of our central offices. And our Dean of Students has authority over our school's sexual and gender-based policy for students. We have about 40,000 students on our campuses, actually growing to 50,000 in the next couple of years, which is a bit terrifying. We have about 4,000 students living in residence, and we're a largely commuter campus in an urban center. And our team that works with survivors and persons who've caused harm under our policy, we call them our student life team. And specifically the folks that do most of this work, we call them student care coordinators. So essentially there are case managers. And so specifically under the policy, we work with survivors to support their needs, implement different modifications. So these folks do lots of liaising between the persons who've experienced harm, responsible for harm, and different campus partners and stakeholders. And I wanted to give those folks a shout out, those student care coordinators, because I think this is a really, really difficult job. And I think all of these jobs are really difficult. But when I think about those folks, they're really tasked with having an expert working level of our different policies, not just our sexual and gender-based policy, but our discrimination, duty to accommodate. And then they have to sort of filter and translate that information for students and look for ways to be creative in terms of meeting those students' needs. So if you are one of those folks on campus, or you supervise those folks on campus, or you work with them, these folks are in a really good position to test and challenge our policies and really ask, whose needs are being prioritized. Are they the folks that we're trying to help? Are they the institutions? And are those folks' voices at the table? And again, something to reflect on. Is there a gap at your organization between your frontline and your policymakers? I can tell you at our institution, there's not, because Deb Eriks is very consultative. Okay. So this work is complicated and hard, and I'll probably sound like a broken record the number of times I probably say this, but it really is critical. And I believe when we engage in this work and when we do this work right, this work really can support healing of the survivor, healing within our communities, and can even prevent further violence from occurring. We must place the survivor in the center of all of this work. And I loved Possibility Seeds had a post on their Instagram a week ago that said, nobody is disposable. And I really like that, because for people who are a member of our community, engaging them in this work, if they've caused harm, is still a signal to them that they still hold value, and as educational institutions, I do think we have a responsibility to come at this from an educative lens. That being said, especially if your institution is embarking on this work or considering it, there are absolutely optics to manage. There will be some people in your communities that do not think that persons who've caused harm deserve support or what could be considered a second chance. We also know in most of our environments, resources are quite limited. And so if there's only so many resources to go around, putting resources into programs that support and work with persons who caused harm may not be well received. And so absolutely some things to manage there. That being said, within our Dean of Students office, I have seen the transition on our campus sort of, pre-sexual and gender-based policy time and post. And again, I do think we've come a long way. I really think it has been an evolution, and I think that we're still evolving. Before we had our policy in place, which for us was in 2017, we were able to do some of what we do now, but it was a lot trickier. There wasn't the increased levels of education around gender-based violence and community support that I see happening now. And so in order to support survivors' needs, we often had to explore those non-adjudicative options, for example, like a no contact, on a more voluntary basis. So I would often, hear these needs or get these requests and sit back and ask myself, are there any policies that are preventing me from doing this? Or are there any risks that are going to emerge from me doing this that I can't mitigate or I can't handle? But I felt like I was often treading lightly. So the approach could probably best be described as, it felt like the right thing to do, but it goes without saying that having our policy approved in 2017, it's given us greater ability and stability to do this work. And I want to share just a quick story of, again, other evidence of culture change that I thought was really noteworthy. I had an opportunity a couple of years ago to be a participant in a first responder training put on by the Alberta Association of Sexual Assault Centers. And, there's a couple of my colleagues in this training, but the other participants was members of a local football team, sort of like that pre-professional level. And so I thought that was kind of cool and different that they would choose to spend their time like that. And then, quickly learned that they'd actually been working with someone in our professional community on looking at things like gender-based violence within their team and concepts like toxic masculinity and what sort of healthier locker room talk could look like. And these folks, again, young men, really positive though, and they were very open about how their culture had evolved and how they now recognize how unhealthy and it was, and how now when they welcome a new team member into their group, how they really put it out there, what their values are, what they're trying to promote and what won't be tolerated. And so I know there's lots of negative reputations out there with different sports teams. Some of it is deserved, but there are teams that are out there engaging in the work and trying to do better. So wanted to share something positive with this heavy topic. The next thing I'll share is this diagram. I have a lot of very low-tech diagrams today, so bear with me. That's kind of how I roll. But I like this diagram because it shows the relationship between the survivor's needs, which can often include the person who caused harm's accountability, and that both of these are within the post-secondary's realm of responsibility to address. They're all interconnected. And again, thinking about our evolution, I think in the past, I think the two smaller circles existed. That could actually be questionable depending on how far back you went, but I don't actually know if they would have been overlapping. They might have been quite disconnected because I think there has been in the past a disconnect between the survivor's needs and the person who's caused harm's accountability. There's probably still likely scenarios that could be defined like that. And I'm curious to see as we continue to evolve, thinking 5-10 years into the future, how will this diagram change? What don't we know today that we're going to learn? And what don't we know yet? And I find that exciting and kind of inspiring. So moving into our approach, what is a needs-based approach? And I'll have you for a minute just reflect on your weekly grocery shopping trip. Okay. And if you're someone who normally makes a list for the grocery store, I want you to imagine the list you would make if it was things that you needed from the grocery store. Okay. And on a separate piece of paper, I want you to imagine the list that you would make if it were things you desired from the grocery store. Okay. And I don't know about you, but my list would probably look pretty different in that, needs are those things that are really necessary for our survival. We probably define them as essential. They can also sometimes be seen as things that we might feel like we're insufficient in, so working with a survivor of gender-based violence, they're feeling unsafe. They may feel insufficient in safety and therefore have a need around safety. And our needs can also be a bit more subconscious, which sometimes can make them a little bit harder to describe. And desires are obviously, they're things that we think we need or things that we want. And when working with survivors, we really do need to be aware of both. But why this focus? Why has our team here really taken this needs-based approach? I believe it's inherently intersectional. And again, if you think of your own needs, they reflect our unique identities, positions, our culture, and more. And so someone sharing a need with you might also lead them to sharing something about themselves, which tells you more about their needs. It helps build that relationship and that trust between you, which is really critical for working in a supportive way. I think about someone telling me that they need the highest level of confidentiality after they've made a disclosure could reflect a cultural norm that they're worried about. Someone telling me that they need help figuring out how to tell their best friend what happened to them, maybe they'd experienced gender-based violence, might tell you that they're worried that they won't be believed by someone who's really important to them because what they need is validation. And someone who tells you they might only need help getting, an extension on a paper, so an academic modification, might be telling you that right now, they need to not think about what happened in order to survive, right? So varying levels. And so I'll throw another question at you. And this one might feel a little bit more complicated, but please, take a minute to reflect. But for those of you, especially that, are working frontline, what are some examples of needs that might be communicated as something else? Or what are some of the things that you hear and what are some of the needs that might be behind them? Okay, great. So students might ask for academic modifications because they need their academic identity to not be impacted, right? Students have an identity as a student. Yeah, time away to recover. Go to class without meeting the person that harmed them. Personal space and safety. These are all needs that I think we hear quite a bit. Lighter workload, I love that. Yeah, just to create some breathing space. Awesome. Great work, everybody. So I'll invite you to keep contributing to that, but start to think about, how do we approach these sensitive and complicated conversations with somebody that we don't even know? That's a tough question. And I like to think, if nothing else, we approach them with transparency and authenticity. And that can sometimes be the best way to start some of these really complicated conversations. Okay, I'll invite you to keep contributing, but I'm going to switch on to the next slide. I warned you about my high-tech graphics, but again, I like to think about, my context within a university. I might frame this as, what does a survivor need to allow them to reach their full potential as a student, or their own definition of success as a student? And this can be on a continuum, because it can also be, what does this person need to live another day? There are a lot of continuums in this work with what people need, desire, and what that might look like. And so, on one end of our spectrum here, it might be needs around survival, and the other end might be needs around thriving. One student might express a need to feel safe, walking through a particular hallway on campus, or another student might need a new graduate supervisor. Both are important and critical to address the needs and also the rights that survivors have around their expectations in their learning experience and the learning environment. And in my experience, survivors are also usually already doing their own adjustments or modifications to address the needs that they have. For example, I see survivors that have employed a buddy system to make sure they're never alone with the person who's caused them harm, or they've drawn some firm boundaries explicitly with that person, or they're flat out avoiding a space, sometimes to the detriment of their own academic success, maybe not going to class. And so my approach is always to explore what is the highest level of intervention or support that the university can provide to somebody, but that the survivor wants, in order to lessen the amount of emotional energy and personal modifications that they need to make. Again, another area to tread lightly, because I wouldn't want someone thinking that I thought they needed saving who hasn't asked for it. But if someone feels like, they've had their power taken away and I can help them get that back through some different, modifications, then that's a really great space to have a conversation, and I joke, but to be clear, unless someone asks you to save them, don't do that. In terms of desired outcomes, these can be the same things as a need and can be communicated both ways. What I want you to think about here is what you do when a survivor expresses a desired outcome that you immediately know that you can't do. An example that jumps to mind is when I hear, I want them kicked out of school. And we know that this could happen as a result of a complaint process, but we also know that's not a fast process and that outcome isn't guaranteed. And so hearing something like this, I often feel like I'm kind of pulling back the layers, of an onion. So I want to honor what the person is feeling and start to try and explore what needs exist within the desire to have that person expelled. Listening and asking questions that won't necessarily tell me more about what gender-based violence occurred, but will reveal more about, the relationship that exists between the people, if there is one, and what needs the survivor is trying to address. So, I might say something like, I can definitely give you more information on the complaint process, but can you tell me more about why you want this person removed from campus? What's going on for you? So that it's not that I'm dismissing it. I'm trying to learn more. So, in this example, let's say that a survivor expresses that they don't feel safe with the person on campus, then we can go ahead and explore what we can do to address their needs around safety. And usually the things that we can't do, it's usually because they're out of scope of the university, or they are things that will need a formal complaint process. I also want to acknowledge that many people have no idea what they need. And so asking them, what do you need? I often hear I have no idea. And so when that happens, I find it can be easiest to go sort of backwards, making space for them by offering to go over the different options with them first. So in doing this, I can walk a survivor through different options and just see how they react. And often I'll hear that they confidently don't want something, or that they confidently do want something, and sort of lots in the middle. For example, it's common for me to be explaining interim measures and have a survivor say, okay, so you would have to talk to him. How will you do that? What will you say? When will you reach out? Right. And so even those reactions, I think, could highlight needs around, safety, confidentiality, and possible repercussions that they're anticipating in their social environment. Okay, so moving into how we would continue to go about exploring those accountability options with survivors, we want to set up the space. And again, really being needs driven. And, even having the people across campus that regularly receive disclosures understand what you and your team can do is really, really helpful, so that we're setting expectations, and that, a survivor doesn't come in thinking that we can do something we can't. We don't have magic wands. And, thinking about the little things when you're setting up the space, are they comfortable coming to your office? Is there a better space they'd like to meet? Virtual meeting has given us so much flexibility. Do they need to bring a friend? Thinking about all of those little things. And my goal here is always to make sure that someone knows that we're here to help them and support them, and to understand their options and to understand that they have choices. And so, your setup can look different depending on what you already know, and what resources the person might already have access to in advance. And also to ask yourself if you're the right person to meet with them. And I know with smaller teams, you might be the person to meet with them, but if you are on a larger team, it is good to make sure that there's no conflicts at hand there. And then I think many of you are probably already very, very adept at just, building rapport. So I'm always sure that I'm very transparent from the beginning when I meet with the survivors, sharing our scope, what information I might already have, and that, being really upfront that, I don't know them, I don't know their experiences, their background, or their goals, but I'm open to hearing what they're comfortable sharing. And also acknowledging that the referral pathway can give some insights sometimes into what's happened, or the student support system. So, I might say, I understand you've been referred by the Sexual Assault Center. Have you been getting support there? How's that going? In the event that there's any support gaps. Okay. So I'm going to give you a scenario here that we're going to use to continue working through this section. And it's a scenario from residence. So let's say that we have two friends in residence, a female identifying student and a male identifying student, and they've spent lots of time together. They often study together. They've been sexual with each other. They might describe themselves to each other sort of jokingly as friends with benefits, but there's no formal label on them. And let's say the female student is studying in her room one night, and the male student comes over and asks to study, and she says, sure. And then she decides, she's ready to go to bed. And he asks if he can sleep over. And this is something that they've done from time to time. They've slept in the same bed. And she said, you can sleep over, but I just want to be clear that I have to get up really early tomorrow morning. And so I don't want anything to happen. And he said, sure. And so she went to sleep. And then shortly after she had fallen asleep, she woke up to him touching her. His hand was on her breast and in her pants. And so she, was obviously alarmed. She asked him to leave, kicks him out of her room. And next day wakes up and she receives this text message conversation from him. And so he reaches out to her and he says, hey. And she says, hey. And he says, I've been thinking about last night. I don't feel great about what happened. And she's super annoyed that he's not feeling great because she's like, are you kidding me? But she says, yeah, me neither. And he says, I'm sorry about what happened. I know you said you didn't want to do anything. And she said, yeah, I didn't. And so she's really confused. And she said, but I do still want to hang out. We just need to talk way more next time. And he says, I totally agree. Let's ask each other a million times to make sure we're both cool. I'm so sorry. She's pretty annoyed at this response. She's feeling really confused. So she doesn't answer, and she makes some space for herself. A couple of days later, she's still really struggling with what happened. And so she goes and makes a disclosure to a residence life staff member, who then refers this person to you. Let's say you work in the Dean of Students office. And so the student is coming to meet with you, and we have these situations where someone is referred from another office on campus and they've already made a disclosure to the person in residence. In that situation, I know that I can usually go ahead and help them without hearing a full disclosure. If they're looking for the university to do something in some way, I might need a little bit more information at some point. But initially, I'm just really making sure that, the gender-based violence policy is sort of like in effect. If it's not, then you still have a student in front of you who needs help. And I would encourage you to just help that student. So let's say I have this person, I'm meeting with this woman. And, as I said, I'd like to be transparent, and I would acknowledge and understand that, they had experienced gender-based violence and had reached out to residents for help and further information, and was hoping that, I could go over some various options with them. And then I like to think about kind of a curtain analogy here, in that the students that we meet with have all of this information, their experiences, their needs behind a curtain. And I really want them to know that it's their choice if they pull the curtain back a little bit, a lot, or not at all. And so depending on what they want to do and what their needs are, we may be able to help them without actually knowing anything or very little. And I want you to imagine how beneficial that might be to somebody to be believed and to ask for help and just get it. And imagine the person, in this case in residence, who's referring them knows that and can tell them that. It could lessen or remove barriers that could exist for accessing help. And so let's say the student, comes forward, and initially she said, well, I'm really having trouble focusing in school. I could really use, an extension with this paper coming up. And so, we go ahead and put that into place. We do this academic modification, and she still really hasn't told me anything. So I might ask, is there anything else I should know in order to help you? And it's her choice at that time if she shares more or not. For options where we would need to know the identity of the person who caused harm and potentially what happened, we could tell the survivor that as we go, right? And let them know if they need to pull that curtain back, why, and what we would be doing with that information. And that would be for more steps that involve the person who caused harm, like imposing interim measures and that sort of thing. And that being said, I never make the assumption that a survivor doesn't want to tell me what happened. Again, I leave it up to them in terms of meeting their own needs with that. So let's say this same student comes back a couple of weeks later, and they're still really struggling with what happened with this person. And, they're starting to articulate some needs around wanting some accountability with the person who caused harm. So, I would revisit the options with this person. And, at this time, if they want to go forward with something, let them know that then I would need the name and maybe what happened in terms of being able to share a summary of the disclosure with the person who caused harm. But I would want that person's consent and agreement about the level of detail that I was sharing, and that the really explicit language that I would use. And then I would also obviously revisit support with that person, and in this scenario, if they hadn't accessed help yet and we're meeting in person, I might ask them if they want to go and visit our sexual assault center. And again, continue to ask them, like, is there anything else I should know in order to help you? And again, just checking in on their needs. And it really can be that specific. Just, how are you feeling? Do you need anything else right now? And often I find folks want some time to think about this if they don't know right away. So moving on to some different accountability options, there are lots of things that we can do here. Again, we're not talking about complaints, but complaint is an option. Interim measures, depending on what their needs are, that we would brainstorm and develop these with a survivor. And with those, we'd want to clarify, the scope, how they'd be implemented, what language we would use, all of that nuance and detail, I think is really, really important in making sure that we're not just implementing an action, but it is directly related to the needs that the survivor had. Similarly, different modifications, if there's other academic assistance that this person might need to meet their academic needs. And, if they're sharing class with this person, maybe they need some help, not being in the same group project, or maybe they need a seating plan in the class so that they never have to worry about the person who caused harm coming to sit beside them. And then there's also different restorative processes. And, looking back, let's say the survivor had shown me a copy of the screenshot of the text messages. This person did acknowledge that they'd done something wrong in that text message. And so that might be enough of what we identify as like a restorative impulse, that if the survivor is looking for, accountability that includes, acknowledgement or taking responsibility of the person who caused harm, this might be a really good area to explore. But again, we not that we tread lightly, but I think we tread carefully as we explore those options. We could think about a letter of apology, either sort of a one-way or two-way, different education with the person who caused harm. And this is something I hear quite a bit, concern that this person doesn't truly understand what they did. And, what would that education look like in order to prevent future harm from happening? And And then there's lots of other stuff, even just help telling their friends or family. If they're sharing a space together in residence, they might want help, having one of them move to a different location or different spatial restrictions. And then just really focusing on support and recovery. So lots of different accountability options that we could explore here. And so in those options, what we think about what needs might be met for the survivor. Again, it was tempting to draw another low-tech continuum here, but it could be everything from survival to meeting their goals as a student. As I said, preventing future harm, different types of healing. I think we all heal in very different ways. And some people, getting that validation or acknowledgement or someone taking responsibility can be very healing for some people. She might also want to explore like almost repairing the relationship. They did have a prior relationship, and obviously, trust has been broken in this example. There might be impacts to their social circle or their friend group. So there might be different relationships that need attending to, not just with the person who caused harm. There could be different types of cultural or spiritual healing that might need to be attended to. And also in terms of a need, just that personal agency, understanding that it's really okay to have strong boundaries, and assert yourself and be like a leader and very clear in how others can and cannot treat you. And this is something that I've also seen over the years as people really start to feel comfortable being an advocate for themselves. And so again, I'm sort of floating in and out of the scenario, but let's say, so we make a plan based on what the survivor has articulated around their needs. And, we would work with them to ensure we were emphasizing how and when we would communicate with the person who caused harm throughout, so that they know kind of all of our steps and are sort of going through that with us, that we would never take any steps without their full buy-in, consent and knowledge. And a question I'll have you reflect on here without a mentee is just, how do we continue to center survivors while supporting the person who caused harm to be accountable? So, think back to that overlapping circle example, and really thinking about how do we keep their needs centered and be really explicit about that. And sometimes it is being really explicit just through the language that you're using. And sometimes I find I even have to reinforce it. If I start to hear things like, well, I don't want to get him into trouble, or, he's dealing with a lot right now, I don't want this to be another thing. It's finding a way to maybe gently but explicitly, like, let that person know that they're absolutely within their own right to, stand up for themselves and taking steps to address the different needs that they have. I often also hear, I don't want everyone to be mad at me, and recognizing that some people might be either, culturally socialized not to assert themselves in contexts of abuse because of different racialized or gendered norms, for example. And often, recognizing that some women survivors may struggle to assert different boundaries or suppress angry feelings because they're worried about a negative reaction or worried about people being mad at them. So I think, for here, it's really reaffirming that they have choices and they have control. And so, to close out this example, let's say because the student had a prior relationship with the other student, she's feeling a lot of confusion about what happened, and, she's taken some space for a while, but now she wants to pursue a restorative conversation with the other student to try and create a space where she can talk about, the harms she experienced and know that he's listening. And, she wants to get to a space where she's confident that he really understands the impact of his behaviors and know that he won't do it again. So she really needs to feel heard, validated, and needs to know that she's also preventing future violence, both to herself and potentially others. Which is a segue into working with people who have caused harm. Again, it's a mouthful, it's a really big acronym. So I'm going to use the term working with and support for persons who caused harm, but I want to be explicit that this type of work and the support offered is different than what we offer to survivors. This work and support differs, and that it focuses more on everyone's safety while still holding the person who caused harm accountable. It's still person-centered. We still treat all people with dignity and respect. And there was a great article coming out of MacEwan University a couple of weeks ago about a respondent education program they're building. And I thought this quote was great. Thinking that part of our work is in doing the idea that perpetrators are these bad, scary other people who we can clearly identify, when in reality, people accused of sexual violence are most often people we know, our friends, family, neighbors, or other people we're in community with. And this is Roxanne Runyon. In fact, we're all swimming in an ocean of rape culture. We're all a part of it, and we all have the capacity to cause harm and repair it. Again, thinking back to the possibility Seed's quote about nobody is disposable. And, at the beginning, I mentioned I was part of the Courage to Act, working with people who cause harm community of practice. And this is an excerpt, so shameless plug. This is the roadmap that we developed. We used a sort of a nature waterfall analogy of the different steps that you might go through working with persons who caused harm as part of a complaint process. But I wanted to just highlight the middle section that looks at working with respondents, because we've highlighted here as well that, we're using a similar framework working with persons who caused harm as working with survivors, in that, it should be trauma-informed, intersectional, feminist, anti-oppressive, based in restorative and transformative justice, and human rights informed. And with that, we're going to do one more scenario here. So again, thinking about some sporty folks here, I want to imagine this time that we have a direct disclosure to our office. So let's say 3 women come forward to our office, and they're members of a co-ed intramural sports team. And one of the men on their team has been on a regular basis making comments and engaging in behaviors that are really sexist, misogynistic, rape jokes, and is often, slapping them on their butts before and after games. And they've approached him a few times, made it really clear that they don't appreciate this behavior. And his response is usually to laugh it off. And so these women let you know that they just want the behavior to stop. They need to feel safe playing sports, and they need to be in an environment where, this behavior isn't happening. And so we overview options, and they want to explore a restorative conversation, because they feel that that engagement and that level of understanding for him is going to best meet their needs. So similar to how we prepare for a meeting with a survivor, it looks very similar here, except this time we're framing it with the survivor's needs in mind, right? We already have some information. So we have a disclosure, we have a sense of what they want to move forward with. We're still going to gather some information. We may ask the women more information about his behavior after they've confronted him. Has it lessened at all? Has it escalated? Has it stayed the same? That gives us some sort of good intelligence on what we might expect. Again, we're going to ask ourselves who should be having the meeting. I think this is a more critical question with the person who's caused harm. And again, this can be really tough if you're a team of one or a very small team. But again, if these meetings are truly meant to be non-punitive and non-disciplinary, you really can't go into that meeting wanting to give a lecture or wanting to tell somebody or engage them in shame, right? So it's really good to pause there and ask yourself, who's in the best position to take this meeting on? And then just be really clear about the goals of your meeting. So during the meeting, again, remember that multi-partial. And again, this, I think, being very honest, I find this much harder meeting with the person who's caused harm that we have a disclosure about. But still continuing to think about sort of like the power of small talk. So this person's likely coming into your meeting, there could be a variety of reactions, and we'll get to that. And it can be very hard to predict what those reactions are, but making sure that you're taking steps to see them as a person, even if it's just asking them, where are you from? What are you studying? Trying to create a space where you're not trying to head towards having this person escalate, right? So you're not trying to frame your conversation in a way that it's likely to escalate. And yet in the same breath, you're also not trying to protect this person from uncomfortable emotions, right? You believe that harm was caused and you believe that this person was responsible. And so you're not protecting them, but thinking about what the impact of shame is. It's not likely to foster conditions for learning more healthy or socially constructive behaviors or unlearning behaviors that are based in toxic masculinity. So if you create a space which is really adversarial, it's unlikely to be able to have a productive conversation. It's also good to think about intersectionality when you're having these meetings. Power dynamics in the room. Is this person from an equity seeking group on your campus? How does this play out in terms of how you set up that space? And I think, you know, the third bullet on this slide, I think is really, if I can have you reflect on anything today, it's this question, you know, how do you create a space that, again, is non-punitive or non-disciplinary and can support the person who caused harm, and yet be crystal clear that you believe the survivor, you believe that harm was caused. This is a really unique space to hold, and it can take many meetings. It's unlikely to happen in your first meeting. If that happens for you, please reach out to me and I would love to know your secrets. But I think there's just so many personal challenges and tensions with setting this up and a lot to unpack here. So, you know, similar to the survivor, we're going to make sure that they understand the framework that we're approaching them in, if that's your campus sexual and gender-based policy, for example. And you're going to share that you've received a disclosure, you know, give a description of the concerns that were disclosed, again, making sure you have the survivor's consent for that. And you're going to give them a chance to respond. And depending on the reaction, this is where, you know, you might explore what level of accountability and responsibility that you see evidence of. Again, in the first meeting, I would keep your expectations low. And if you are in a scenario where you're imposing conditions of any kind, like interim measures, you know, ensure that they're crystal clear and the person understands them. You're going to cover, you know, privacy, confidentiality, support options for them. And then again, I would encourage the bulk of the conversation to try and give them an opportunity to explore their behaviors or raise self-awareness. Yeah, and that there's a lot there, a lot of different reactions that we can see. So I want to share another diagram. This is not mine. This is not, because it's higher tech, clearly. But this is a tool that we've used as part of a risk triage framework that we use at the University of Alberta. And so it's thinking about, you know, the behaviors, the intent, and the consequences of the situation that you're aware of. So, you know, after meeting with a survivor, I'll likely have more understanding on maybe the last, so what the consequences are, and maybe the first, you know, depending on how far back that curtain is pulled, how much information was shared. I may not have any information on the intent. Oftentimes there isn't even any awareness around the intent. But this is a good thing to keep in mind, because, you know, in thinking about working in with restorative practices, you know, oftentimes because we're focusing on the consequence, we're focusing on the harms that were caused. Sometimes the intent doesn't matter that much, because if harm was caused, that's where we're going to focus. But in terms of engaging with persons who caused harm, the intent is really good to understand, and it's not necessarily clear. Sometimes, again, you're peeling back those layers of the onion. So what are some possible reactions that we might see? So again, I want you to imagine, you know, maybe you're in your office, you're meeting with that person who's alleged to have caused harm. What are some of the reactions? And I'll encourage you to throw some in here. What are some of the possible reactions that you might see? And I was going to draw another continuum here, because I think there's probably a continuum. But what are some ones that come to mind? Absolutely anger, denial, yep, shock, yep, this is great. It sounds like you folks have done this work before. Denial keeps getting bigger, yep. Victim blaming. What about just lawyering up or total silence? Passive aggressive, see lots of passive aggressiveness, or you know, gaslighting the survivor. Deflection is one I would see. Every now and then, I do see mild acknowledgement. Again, I want you to think of this as a continuum. And, you know, what are some of the ones on the mild acknowledgement? You know, sometimes I see confusion or hurt that the survivor came forward instead of talking to them if they did have a prior relationship. Sometimes we see a highly emotional response, self-victimization. Sometimes accountability. I think accountability would be on the far end of one side here. And so how do we navigate all of these reactions? And again, this is, I think, where we get into the weeds, and it's really nuanced to really look for ways to open up the conversation. Obviously, if someone is coming forward with, you know, adamant denial, there might not be a ton of openers present, but you can always plant some seeds, right? Asking them, do you want to talk about what happened? You know, for folks that are acknowledging, saying, you know, that's important that you acknowledge that you've caused harm. You know, do you want to talk about that more? You know, sometimes I'll hear things like, well, I'm pretty sure I had consent, and being able to revisit that. You know, you said you thought you were pretty sure you had consent. Can we talk about that? Or asking them, you know, what does consent look like to you two? How have you established consent in the past? Right. And really just being okay with diving in. Sometimes it feels awkward and uncomfortable, but recognizing that a lot of these folks don't have anyone else to talk to. And that can be a really great question too. Who do you talk to about these things? Right. And, you know, in our example of our sports example here, if this individual said, well, you know, I always make these like rape jokes around my friends and they think they're really funny. Okay, well, let's talk about a possible echo chamber. You know, do you think your friends actually might not be the best baseline to understand if your jokes are appropriate or not? You know, who else in your life could you talk to and explore about these things? Or, you know, do you really think other members of your team think your jokes are funny? You know, maybe you're actually not fully understanding their reaction, but really trying to get them to recognize or explore, you know, what a path forward might look like for them, where they can have space for self-reflection and growth, right? And I've often said to folks, like, this doesn't actually need to derail your life if that's what they're articulating, but, you know, taking responsibility and being willing to engage in this work, it's difficult work, it's complicated, but it is something that you can move through eventually, but it doesn't just happen with denial and anger. So just some other considerations here. Again, we could probably do a whole workshop on just like how many meetings does it take to sort of really get someone to open up and explore that space around taking accountability or responsibility. But I would encourage you, if you've done any restorative training, to, you know, look for what we call that restorative impulse. And if it's there, to really try and dive into those conversations and see if that person would feel comfortable or safe, you know, going down that path with you. And, you know, using restorative justice to frame questions too. And again, these are definitely more for follow-up meetings, but, you know, focusing on the harm versus the actual behaviors can sometimes open up a really reflective space. And I'll often use a restorative approach to frame questions when, you know, we've imposed interim measures on somebody and they're asking us for a reconsideration, you know, so, you know, since the conditions were put in place, what have you been reflecting on? What have you learned? Who was harmed in that situation? You know, what have you done to repair the harms or rebuild trust? So just some really basic questions, but get people reflecting on their own behaviors and the impact on others. And so, you know, these follow-up questions are often where we start, but we have to recognize that so many factors may influence how somebody reacts, you know, how they were raised, their experience or lack of experience with relationships, their experience with rejection, what they believe in. And so there's a lot of, I think, self-learning and unlearning that also needs to happen for folks. And again, it's asking yourself, do they have the space to do this? You know, do they know who to talk to about this? And so I would encourage you to keep engaging with persons who caused harm and think about what resources that you have access to that might be helpful to them in starting to understand the harm that they caused. And often realizing that you may be the only person that they feel they can talk to about this. And there's a lot of weight with that. Evidence of success. So this is an interesting one. I use sort of success in air quotes, but, you know, thinking about how do you know it's working? How do you know someone's listening? And, you know, I think about cases we've had where, again, somebody might have conditions on them, but they start checking in with me regularly. Well, Sarah, you know, I know that I'm not supposed to be in this space, but can I walk past it? Or, you know, can I be in a room nearby? And, you know, making sure that they're not trying to push the boundaries, but they're actually trying to make sure that they're not making the other person feel safe is really, again, I think it could feel like a small win, but I think it's good to take it where we can. And also considering diversity. You know, I've had students in the past that have disclosed that they are on the spectrum, maybe neurodiverse, and maybe aren't there. They start to be self-aware that they may not be understanding other social cues and want support for that. And so again, just something to have on your radar. We've often over the years had examples where we've had to give limits to support where, you know, if there's conditions in place and we're working with somebody and they're continually ignoring or violating the conditions are in place, we will take a different path with that person. You know, how we work with them and what that support looks like will absolutely look different. I'm happy to chat with you about that. And the last consideration is just to remember your networks. You know, who are your go-to people that you can consult with on the situations you're navigating? You know, do you have a sexual assault center on campus or in the community? Counselors, your human rights folks, Brittany and Deb, I think would be great people to consult with. So just some other things to consider. And so meaningful accountability, you know, I was reflecting, this felt like a really big build-up slide, and I wanted to give you a really solid definition of like what meaningful accountability is and what it looks like. But I don't know if I feel confident. I don't know if I actually have that answer. So I'm sorry if that's a big disappointment. But I think, you know, it doesn't always happen, and we have to acknowledge that. But when it does, you know, it can be a combination of a survivor feeling that they had their needs met and that they have the support and tools to heal or reach their goals or whatever that looks like for them. And so just for the purpose of time, I'm going to skip over that one. Go into like thinking about those of you that are doing this work and what regular debriefing might look like with your team. And I think back, you know, I started doing this work as a team of one in our office. And I remember when I hired my first 2 student care coordinators, and I was like very committed to doing regular debriefs, you know, recognizing this work was hard. And so I put a question on a case manager listserv asking for debriefing suggestions. And I didn't get any responses. And when I followed up, I learned it was because most people are a team of one and might actually not have a team to debrief with. And so that was really eye-opening for me. And so I persevered and offered a lot of teams of one to regularly join our team debrief, which we do on a monthly basis if that had meaning for them. And we often would use this sort of like suitcase or baggage analogy, you know, recognizing that as we engage in this work, we're often collecting different baggage. And where possible, we really want to keep our suitcase light or even empty. And I remember we had finished an academic year and I was sort of, you know, reflecting on the year, and I said to my dean at the time, you know, I said, there's really only 2 cases this year that really hit me hard, that I'm still carrying, I'm still struggling. So I'm like, I think that's pretty good. And he said, well, in 5 years, that's 10 things, Sarah. And I was like, oh man, that math is significant. And so really making sure that, again, we're providing space for yourself and your colleagues to sort of unpack some of this stuff. And if you are interested in some of the debriefing questions we've used in the past, I'm happy to share those. It's been a mix of just, you know, were there any tensions that came up for you this month between, you know, sort of university policy, i.e. what we were able to do and how you wanted to support or work with someone? You know, often there's tension there. You know, what came up for you this month that you're still reflecting on or struggling with? And, you know, just recognizing that we don't often get situations where you can sort of like tie a bow. They don't always wrap up really nicely given the type of work that we do. But what were you proud of this month? You know, where did you feel really effective? And just getting folks to reflect on that. Okay, home stretch. So this feels like a downer in my first bullet, the wrap up considerations, but I have to say that, you know, some cases just feel bad. And the type of work that we do, hopefully you're agreeing with me, but yeah, some cases are just really tough. And you may feel that we're not able to do enough, or, you know, as I said earlier, just so many factors when you have humans involved, we may not be able to sort of tie a bow on things. But it is good to think about creating more spaces outside of your office and across campus to continue to evolve, to make sure that we're moving forward. And so, you know, thinking about who in your organizations are doing this work, you know, can you further do education and training with them? How does this work fit into your existing policy? Is there space for it? Or are you sitting back like I used to, asking like, well, is there anything preventing me from doing it? Right? And trying to see what risks exist. And then just thinking about how we can continue to learn and improve our approach. Again, thinking about hard to think about this approach 20 years ago, and we weren't getting the disclosures we were 20 years ago as we are now, but thinking about what this could look like 5, 10, 15, 20 years into the future is why I continue to do this work. And so really hoping that we really can do better. And with that, I think I will wrap it up and pass it back to Deb, I think.
Yes. Oh, amazing, Sarah. Always, every time we talk, I learn new things, and I just see there is already a question in the chat. Not sure if Sarah will address this, but I would love to hear her views on having the same person who's worked with a survivor also work with the person who caused harm versus having two different people do this.
Sure. Yeah. And I appreciate that as someone who was a team of one, that just might be the only option. And again, I would just encourage as much transparency as possible. And again, to really, really reflect on what a multi-partial approach looks like, because the benefit of that allows you to be, empathetic and caring with the survivor, but also thinking about how you might approach a person who's caused harm. Again, think about that critical space of, you're telling them that you have information that you believe that they did cause harm, but that you value them as a human. And if they're open to it, you are also open to engaging in those types of conversations. But I would just be really transparent with both parties, the role that you're playing, so that there's no surprises. And again, this is why it's good to think about who else on your campus is doing this work, or if you're in an area or a region where there might be other people that you can collaborate with. So my thoughts are that it's very hard, but it is happening and it is doable. It just might not feel like the best practice, but if it's what we have, then that's what we work with.
Okay, we have another one in the chat. How does your campus approach providing support to respondents who are in an adjudicative process? So in the same way that we have support persons for complainants.
So I would say very differently. And again, if a respondent is engaged in either like an on-campus like complaint process or an off-campus criminal process, most of the time they're not interested in engaging with us. And so if they are, again, if you have someone who's open to doing that work, I think, think of the things that I've mentioned today. But, right now our approach of working with respondents is non-clinical. I know some schools do have more specific clinical in terms of counselors or psychologists to work with them. We're very clear about the work that we do, that it's non-clinical. And so we would still be open to that. But in terms of the situation that person is in, acting as a respondent, my experience is that they're often less likely to open up, right? And I think that's, and this is a group that's been doing, talks about complaint process. I think that's one of the downfalls. As soon as we have a complaint on campus or in our criminal system, it's not very encouraging to open up and take responsibility or accountability. So again, I think you can always plant the seeds and let the person know that you're willing. And if someone is willing, and they are engaged in a complaint process, make sure they're engaging for the right reasons and they're not engaging to be able to tell your discipline officer that, they're sorry if that's actually not true. So I didn't put that on a slide, but we also get lied to a lot in this work, don't we? So, yeah.
We do indeed.
Yeah.
Okay. If there are other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. And while people think about that, maybe I'll ask one. Sarah, you talk a lot about sort of work that feels more like community work than individual work, and meaning that you need a whole community to say apply interim measures or to buy in on the modifications, get things done. How can you talk a little bit about how you build those relationships so that you can just have that happen when you need it?
Yeah. And again, I think most people that do this work are pretty busy and may not feel like they have the hours. So I think, it might feel like a side project or a longer project. And, I think depending on your context, it's that relationship building, but also the awareness building of, what your team and what your office is able to do for survivors. And, Deb, I don't know if you want to talk about the options navigation network that you're doing here, but also thinking about ways just to, continue to increase education. And I find, the audience and different stakeholders on campus are really open to collaborating in that fashion, because, we're all invested in student success. And even though they may not be engaging in this work as, their primary work, it might be a case here or there. I find most people are really open and receptive to understanding, what we're trying to do, and at least feel confident that they can articulate and give a really good referral, right? Or that warm handoff.
Yes, I will. I will pass on talking about the Options Navigation Network because we do have another question in the Q&A. So do you have any strategies for addressing your own biases about people who have caused harm to maintain being impartial in supporting them?
That's a fabulous question. And honestly, sometimes I need to go take a walk or give myself enough space to react in the way that, I need to mentally and emotionally before I dive into that. But I think what always brings me back is being committed to trying to find that path forward with the respondent that might give room for real healing and accountability for the survivor. And again, it happens sometimes, it doesn't always happen. But again, and also just really seeing them as a human, right? And again, if you don't have past information about them, you don't know them that well, and all you have is a description of the disclosure, really pushing yourself to, get to know them a little bit. What motivates them? Why do they come to this university? What are their goals? Sometimes that can also be a good strategy to think about, how are these behaviors serving you? How are these behaviors helping you reach that goal or not reach that goal? That's a really good question. I think all of us would probably answer that differently. I think that's really personal, but I happily and honestly acknowledge that can be really tough depending on what the disclosure is.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, that it is so important to recognize that supporting accountability is supportive of the survivor. So it's not like dividing them and treating one with belief and the other with disbelief, but really it is about trying to find that path. So it's hugely important work.
And Deb, that's a great point, because I think even if, think back to the brainstorming we did around the possible reactions, even if you're getting anger and denial, I'll never know if the person actually is listening and is reflecting and actually in the future never harms another person. And so it's still worth it, even if you're not getting that evidence. And so I think that's a really good way to stay connected and to stay, and sort of like a strategy you could use is really just to remind yourself why you're engaging at all. Because the alternative, I think, is probably reflective of how our processes looked years ago, right? Where somebody would come in, we tell them we had a disclosure. Do you have anything to say? Okay, here's the conditions. See you later. Please don't violate these, right? Our approach now really rounds out that edges and tries to create space and work with that reaction and try and meet them where they're at.
Excellent advice. Last call for questions. Are there any more? Oh, I have a Q&A. Are there any best practices for providing educational sessions for respondents, making sure they're engaging and effective as possible?
Well, again, MacEwan has we need to, I think, see what MacEwan University is up to. And part of the Courage to Act, working with people who caused harm, we did a bunch of research, and there's some great stuff happening in community. So, I'm happy to follow up and share what I had learned, but, there is stuff out there, and some of it may be specific to respondent. Some of it might just be, education and awareness raising around gender-based violence, and really understanding what that is and how it translates to relationships and harm. And so I feel like that's like a whole other webinar.
Maybe a series.
Yeah.
All right. I think that may be it. We do want to take a moment at this final event for the Reporting, Investigation, and Adjudication Working Group to express our gratitude. So that's me and Brittany. We are the group. We are the working group, and we've worked with a number of folks along the way. So, we've learned a great deal from this project and are really humbled by the support we've received, not just from Wage Canada, but from Possibility Seeds and the Courage to Act team as well. Special thanks to Laura Murray, Anuth Naushan, Andréane Saint-Gelais, Emily Allen, Kitty Rodet, Aubriana Snow, Noemi Villieu, and Maya Kotlarenko for the invaluable technical and administrative and moral support. Also, thank you, though, to Zanab Jaffrey, CJ Rowe, Jen Flood, and others in the Courage to Act team who have come and gone, but whose contributions to our projects were so critical. Thanks also to those folks in the communities of practice who diligently read, reviewed, and commented on our work. Sarah, you were among them, I believe. They held us accountable and ensured that the guide and other tools are reliable, legally sound, and grounded in principles of anti-oppression. A huge thank you to Farah Khan for trusting us with this work and for walking with us on this journey. A gigantic thank you to Sarah, who has given us just amazing advice and things to think about, lots of things to reflect on. And really, a lot of it is about questions to ask ourselves about our own practice and about our own assumptions when we enter this work. So finally, we wanted to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for the work you do and for spending this time with us. We really, really appreciate and take inspiration from your commitment to addressing and preventing gender-based violence on your campuses. And we are really lucky to be able to work alongside each and every one of you. Thank you for joining us. And a kind reminder, please complete the evaluation forms. We also have much to learn from you. So take care for now, everyone, and goodbye.